Well, welcome, and thank you for joining me out here in the land of California. So, I just I did a chat with Rex last week, and we talked
Hmm.
Russian airplanes because when I grew up in military history, we always wondered why Hitler would invade Russia. And the more we start looking at that logic, it seems based on what the Russians were doing and how they were building up their military up to 40, 41. It did seem it was quite inevitable, and it was pretty much a crapshoot which one of the two was going to invade whom first. And now that the files opened up in the 90s, and more and more stuff came out of Russia. So Viktor Suvorov, he wrote Icebreaker, and Sean just wrote another book on Stalin's War. It seems now that Stalin and the Russians, they were planning on a westward move from when? From the mid
Suvorov,
30s.
the name Suvorov sounds familiar. I thought was he not controversial?
It was very controversial when Suvorov he wrote that book because he basically said, well, Stalin played the political game to get the Allies and Germany into it, so he could invade Germany and the West when everyone was done fighting. But he was the first one that wrote this. It was 20, 25 years ago. He's an old Russian spy, which I guess is why he might be controversial. And that's why interesting because back then it was still seen that Russia was this poor, unprepared country that was thrown into this vicious attack, despite the Russians had invaded just as many countries by 1941 that the Germans had. Um, and then now more and more Western historians are starting to follow suit and follow up on what he wrote and actually verify it as more and more documents are coming out. And so we chatted with Rex, and he agreed that the Russian Air Force was very much a tactical air force bent on an attack. So I'm thinking, well, from what the Russians learned at Kankingol and in Finland, which was not small lessons. What was the Russians building? What was their armored force intended? What were they thinking before the war?
Well, it
Can
was
we look
certainly
at
offensive, all right. But I mean, the Russians had this issue that their thinking was beyond their capability. So you go back to the early 30s. So Stalin also had this thing about using the Red Army as a partly way of kickstarting the economy by ordering thousands of tanks. And I presume, I don't know if Rick said the same thing for aircraft as well, but his 5-year plan was to produce a hell of a lot of stuff, and all that stuff meant employment for the factories and technical improvement and so on and so forth. Of course, for the greater abilities of the Red Army to go and spread freedom and democracy. No, wait, wrong country. Around to the proletariat, who were just waiting to be liberated from their bourgeois oppressors. Yeah. But so with all these thousands of tanks that they were making, they weren't fantastic tanks, but they were pretty reasonable, T-26s. The idea was that, well, what do we do with them, as I say? And if the Air Force was offensively minded, so was the Army. And that's where you get, like, deep battle from all the various persons that they have. And I never had time to do the final research. I have my own video on Russian doctrine anyway. But the idea of deep battle was a brilliant idea. And okay, we're going to do operational depth. It's basically the start of the operational arc. We're going to do operational depth penetrations. We're going to really stamp through. And they would develop different types of tank to conduct this type of penetration. So that you would have the penetration tanks, then you would have the deep penetration tanks that would do a lot of the careening around. What today we might consider perhaps cruiser tanks, from the British Army. And so he develops this doctrine. And the people in charge look at the doctrine and says, this is brilliant. And I seem to recall also involved paratroopers as well. But anyway.
2 million of them, according to Pravda. And you know that Pravda is not going to lie to you. We give you exact information of what we told you.
So the doctrinaires, the people up in charge of Red Army headquarters, said, this is a brilliant doctrine. We shall officially make it our doctrine. And so they put it into field testing. And then they realized that there were two problems. Firstly, the tanks they have are not mechanically capable of conducting the doctrine. And the second thing is that the people they have are not tactically capable. They're just not trained enough and whatever to conduct the doctrine. So it was a case of, this is a brilliant doctrine in theory, but in practice it falls flat. And there's another example of that. If you want to get a little bit more modern, look at the Israeli effects-based doctrine from about 2006. And if you read the professional journals like in Armor Magazine, the American Doctrine, the American Journal, it says like most Israeli officers really didn't have much of an interest in French postmodernist philosophy. And even if they did, they probably couldn't understand it. And this is the doctrine that they were being told to execute. So I guess to an extent, some of this echelon above reality was happening with the Red Army in the 1930s.
I mean, never let reality interfere with a good story.
Anyway, so I mean, I haven't looked too deeply into the Israeli doctrine myself. All I know is that in my classes we were told to read this article, and this article said it's just not the way you develop a doctrine.
Oh.
There were two problems that happened. Firstly, deep battle was quietly nixed as the official doctrine because, as I said, it didn't work yet. And the second thing is that the purges started happening, and it just happened that the people who were advocating towards deep battle doctrine also happened to be the people that were getting purged, and you didn't want to be associated with it. So now, whether or not there was any actual correlation between the support deep battle and the purge, I don't know, and I've not seen anything that specifies one way or the other that deep battle as a concept is purgeable. But the people who were associated with it were purgeable. So if you're associated with those people, be careful.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to take somebody who just got locked up and take his idea and run with it. Then you're associated by
definitely not. Yeah. So, but by the time you start getting to Finland, so late 1930s, a lot of the advancements in armored thought, were actually being reversed. So the various tank brigades, if I recall, they were being consolidated back to a pure infantry support role. They weren't as much combined arms anymore, as they were starting to become more like the French idea of a homogeneous force that will be allocated by the front commander to a specific fight, conduct that fight in support, and then they were treated separately. But yeah, in all cases, the thinking was still, attack. But realistically, what country is attack not the default?
Well, that's true. And you look at some of the weapons they made, like the amphibious tanks. What was it, the T-38, that could practically sail. I think it set the world record in sailing through one lake for 600 kilometers, something ridiculous. And you have these extremely fast-moving BT series that can race forward. It doesn't seem like there's not a whole lot of defensive structure in having something that races fast forwards. Or you have the TB3 that would carry the T-27 and 2 million paratroopers.
Drop it over the lake.
It's not very defensive. Paratroopers are not very defensive in nature, I believe. and it just strikes me against. And then they placed all of these tanks right up on the border in 41, and built some 242 airfields right on the border with Germany, with the German forces, right opposite the German troop concentrations as well. So, I mean, by the winter of 1941, the Russians have lost 22,340 tanks. So to say they're not prepared for the war, considering they had 22,300 tanks to lose.
Well, it's also worth noting how many of them were T-34s. They lost something like 90% of all their T-34s in the first 6 months of the war.
The last number I had was 1,200 JS1s and T-34s. There was 1,200 total. But the crews were not, again, we're back to the training. You may have the right medium, but they weren't well trained and they weren't prepared.
Well, that was part of it. I mean, the T-34s weren't great either. So they had this bizarre idea that they had training sets and had war sets. So out of 100 tanks that had, let's say, 10 of them were the ones that you could start the engine and drive around and conduct training. And the other 9 of them, 90%, they would sit in the motor pool, occasionally just change the oil to make sure the oil was fresh, but they wouldn't actually operate them because they didn't want them to wear out. So obviously, if you're only using a very small portion of your vehicles, and also today, of course, we know that if you don't run a vehicle routinely, it's probably worse than running it routinely.
Yes.
You end up with hangar queens. So obviously, they hadn't quite figured that bit out yet.
Does that also mean that 90% of the tank crews were not trained?
Well, they tried to cycle.
Yeah.
Those crew. It wasn't that only the 10% whose vehicles they were got trained. Everybody cycled through this training set. I'm just going through my book here. Go on.
This was the time where, I mean, today everything is so much more expensive, so much more sophisticated, like those beautiful tin cans that you wheeled around in. You get a tank that can do everything now. Back then, didn't you? They built tanks to need that one thing for this, one for that, one for that, one for that.
Yes.
So when you look at what they built, is there a difference in if you can attack? You would almost think the Russian doctrine. I remember teaching the Russian doctrine of attack for the Cold War, where everybody would just forwards. Run in, take up from the dead, and so forth. Not much different, infantry different from World War II. And I'm thinking, is that the extent of the training that they were trained? They were trained and prepared to attack, drive forwards, shoot everything, and stop in Berlin, as opposed to teaching how to defend and hold.
Again, you can't blame the Soviets for that, though. I mean, can you imagine just how much time General Patton spent in training defensive maneuver with his troops? One of the things that made Montgomery such a good general in 1940 was the fact that he trained his troops how to withdraw as well as how to attack. And I mean, my own personal gripe about the way people think that, Montgomery appeared out of nowhere in 1942 for El Alamein. No, he actually did very well in France.
Yes, he did. And he was supportive of his troops having condoms as well.
Yes.
Which almost got him completely fired and banished, which is a completely different story that is very amusing.
I'm sure Patton would have fired him. I mean, again, today. So, I mean, how many times, even I, in the 21st century, how many times have I done an attack, a platoon in attack versus platoon in defense? And for about 15 years, trenches went away. So when I went to basic training in the US, there was actually a trench firing position that you sat there with your M16 and you set it to full auto, and you were defending the pop-up horde that were coming at you from the trench. Well, that went away for like 20 years. And trenches are only starting to come back now in US training. Something to do with events going on in Europe somewhere.
I heard that there's some noisy stuff going on out there. Very interesting learning. There's going to be a very interesting post-mortem coming out of that.
There will. The question is whether or not I'm still going to be in the army when that happens.
Well, we can always hope.
I'm still trying to find that figure that says how many T-34s were killed, but it was a ridiculous number.
It was a very high amount. And it's very interesting when they talk about the T-34 being so much. I guess it was a lot of the Russian tanks were not inferior to any other tanks in the late 30s. If you look at the specs of them, a lot of them had heavier armor and larger caliber weapons than even the Germans. If I looked at the specs of them all, so it's not like it was a backwoods military, although they might not have had the same production quality.
Well, yeah, you could make the same argument about the British and the French as well. I mean, they had very good tanks, but got beaten up by the Germans. Now, in fairness, of course, someone is going to say, of the 90% of T-34s that were destroyed, how many of them were actually knocked out? Well, not as many as were knocked out by the French, of the French or of the British, but still, there's a fair few of them that were, I think at least half was the figure, were knocked out versus they just broke down on the way. But of course, if a tank breaks down on the way, how good a tank is it? But you got to get there.
I have the production number of T-34s.
Here we go. So they started with 935 T-34s. They received, and this is present. This is in 2 months, between June 22nd and as of August 1st. So they started with 935. They received an additional 526, meaning that they had 1,450 or so on hand. And then, issued. And on hand, and actually functional at the end of August, a month and a half later, is 158. which meant that they lost 1,303. The Northwestern Front lost every one of its 74 T-34s. The Southern Front lost, not too bad. But yeah, Western and Southwestern were the ones that lost it all.
So were they taken intact? Some of them were taken intact.
Somewhere, but one of the observations is that if you look at pictures of destroyed T-34s from the early part of the war, a lot of them look fairly intact.
Yes,
but
it's not.
But if you remember what was shooting at them, you're talking about 20 millimeter, 37 millimeter, and a few 5 centimeter. They don't make big holes.
No.
So, old photograph with low resolution, grainy image of some German guy, and the hole is probably in the side because the Germans had learned, let's not shoot at the front of some of these heavily armored tanks. You just don't see the hole that knocked them out. So it looks, to all intents and purposes, like, it's just another tank that broke down.
That's very true. And the 37 was not as bad. The Pak-36 was not as bad a weapon as a lot of people have made it out to be later. If you knew,
especially not when you realized how many hardcore projectiles have fired.
Sure.
So June 22nd to December 31st, 1941, they fired 207,000 Pak-36 projectiles. And how many of them were hardcore? 30. It looks like about 10 to 15% were hardcore, basically HVAP rounds.
Yeah, and the others were explosive?
No, the others were just regular AP.
Okay.
So, if you're shooting at a T-26 or something, you don't need the hardcore 37.
No.
But if you're shooting at a T-34, you probably want to.
Yeah, or a KV or JS. That's it. Then you need to roll up the 88.
Okay. So they fired an average of 115 hardcore projectiles for each T-34 or KV lost.
Well, considering the Russians had at the end of December 41 had lost 22,300 tanks, they must have been shot at by a lot of things. So if you extrapolate that, that's actually quite fair.
There's another book I have up here shows how many shots even the 8.8 would fire, and it was about 20 rounds for every kill.
Only at land targets, or also
against tanks?
Okay. Yes, I mean they learned that lesson in 1940. You would think they would be quicker in swinging the 88s downwards when you saw Russian heavy tanks.
Well, I mean, they obviously did in order to fire 20 rounds for every kill. The problem is that, despite the accuracy of the 8.8, if the other guy is A, shooting back, and B, trying not to get hit, your 90, yes, the mechanical accuracy, I go to the test range and I can hit 90% of my 95% of my target at 1,300 meters. It's not as good in real life. No, whatever the mechanical accuracy of the gun is.
Yeah, you're right. So the Russian tanks How would they? How would you say they would? But before the ones constructed up until the war started with Germany, how would they stack up? Because they always said this was an inferior military that had crappy stuff. And I'm like, well, on paper, it doesn't look that bad, taking away the numbers. But what they were building, they built some very heavily armored tanks and amphibious. No one else had amphibious tanks. I mean, they must have had. They had some idea. It seems.
The thing about the amphibious tanks is that they at least had the ability to go places that others couldn't. So that said, it doesn't seem to have done all that well for them in Finland anyway. And against the Germans, there weren't quite as many lakes. Obviously, at least not where the Germans were, because the Germans were getting across. And if you look at places like Elitas, where the Germans have to cross a pretty nasty river, and there was a vicious fight. Elitas, I think, was on like day 3 of the invasion. And there were T-34s there. What was interesting about it is that the German tankers never actually encountered the Soviet T-34s at Elitas over the course of the 3 days. They ended up forcing a bridge, forcing a crossing, and flanking the Soviets anyway, to the level that the T-34s either had to be abandoned or withdraw. But in terms of overall, I mean, the average Soviet tank at the time was a T-26. It was a early 1930s Vickers British derivative tank. And compared to the Panzer III, it was not as good. I mean, Panzer III was a fantastic tank. For the time. The T-34 was in theory a great tank. You had your problems of reliability, and you had a problem of the 2-man turret that was practically blind. So I mean, it's like there are T-34 stories a bit like the Char B-1. Oh, this T-34 drove forward, and it took 45 hits from anti-tank guns, and it kept going until eventually it went back to its own lines. The fact that it took 45 hits means that somebody shot it 45 times without a response. And there, but for the grace of God, go I. That one took 45 hits and returned. But that one over there that nobody talks about took 46 hits and didn't.
I mean, you're very occupied when you have time to be shot at that many times.
Yeah.
Stop texting when you're driving, damn it. But
I mean, when it comes down to the organizational side, nobody in World War II was really great at the organizational side at the start of the war. They all had learning experiences, the Germans included, except the advantage was that the Germans had like 2 wars before they got to the Russians, and the Russians just had the Finns. And whilst the Finns certainly taught the Soviets a lot of lessons, they were not the same lessons that you needed against the Germans, because they fought in an entirely different way.
True. And the Japanese, the same thing. I think the Russians learned a logistical lesson in the fact that they were able to transport some 4,000 trucks, 500 artillery, 450 tanks, 1,000 miles from their production base, deploy them, kick ass, and come back. That's a logistical feat in the desert. And then you have the snow. Of course, you don't need amphibious tanks because everything's frozen.
You mentioned Kalkin Gol at the very beginning. I never did get around to it, and that was one of the things. Obviously, is that they did have to send all those guys over there. The Soviets and the Russians, ever since, have always been very, very good at strategic logistics. I remember a briefing maybe about 2 years ago about the events in Ukraine, and one of the generals was basically saying, as far as strategic logistics go, the Russians are masters. Even today, so getting stuff from the wrong end of Russia to the Ukraine area, which is not a short distance, they're very good at. But Kalkin Gol itself was interesting in that it's perhaps a little bit overstated from the Soviet perspective. So certainly the lessons that were imparted to the Japanese was, oh crap, we just got our asses kicked. Let's be a little bit more circumspect about the Soviet Union in the future, and maybe we need to put proper guns on our tanks and so on and so forth.
Arm our planes a little bit, a couple of plates and stuff.
But from the Soviet side, it wasn't. It was a success in as much as they won, but it wasn't anything which was a revelation. It was, I mean, Oh yeah, it was Zhukov doing. Well, what Zhukov did was basically a double development. It's what
Yeah.
everybody wants. It's Cannae. It's brilliant, but it wasn't a novel concept. It wasn't deep battle or anything. It was simply very good tactical application of the forces he had against an enemy that perhaps might not have taken him seriously enough.
Yeah, I think it was the logistical learning, if anything.
That, and I guess the fact that there was a bit of a morale boost for the Soviets that the other army actually.
It was
but
interesting.
But it was the second battle though. The first battle did not go anywhere near so well for the Soviets.
No, it didn't. But it's interesting that the final battle, they didn't advertise it anywhere. It wasn't mentioned or celebrated in Russia at the time, almost as if they kept it slightly secret. It wasn't published in Pravda or anything. No one talked about it, which feels like, why are you keeping a victory secret? Usually that's the kind of thing you stand on. If it was because you learned
because they pulled victory out of the jaws of defeat.
Yeah.
They didn't want to talk about the first batch. And oh, by the way, the guy that was there before Zhukov is what ended up getting purged, if I recall.
Most likely.
More permanently purged than Zhukov was.
Yeah, but a lot of the purged people, they came back eventually from time to time when they were needed. But isn't the, and it's interesting, also I've been in Ukraine a couple of times ever since the war started. I'm looking at the Cold War tactics that I studied, and then World War II. Isn't it a little classic Russian then? Well, we have 1 million people. We'll push them all to the front one way or another, have them all charge forward. If only 900,000 make it, doesn't matter. We still have 900,000. It's mass. And I guess quantity have a quality of its own. Yeah. But I
worry sometimes that that's a bit overstated. Yes, there was a period of time in the beginning of the war that the Soviets were not capable of anything more refined. Whether they knew they could be, or they should be or not, it was a case of, well, crap, we're getting completely overrun. Throw something at the opposition right now to slow them down. And if we lose them, we'll just get the next wave. But by the end of the war, the Red Army was pretty damn good.
Yes.
I mean, their doctrine was different to the Western ones. I mean, both were very heavily dependent on artillery, but both had an entirely different way of doing it, for example.
Yes.
But operationally, they had a very sound tactic. And it wasn't just throw people at the problem.
I mean, they became really good at combined arms warfare towards the end. And they started talking to one another because at the beginning of the war, the tankers couldn't talk to the planes couldn't talk to the tanks, and the tanks could talk to, well, they couldn't talk to each other. They didn't have radios.
Well, that was everybody, really. I mean, when the Panzer battalions or divisions are streaming across eastern France, and you got the Stukas coming in, the tanks were not talking to the Stukas. I mean, it was basically pre-planned artillery.
Sure.
was what it was.
But they have forward controllers, didn't they? The Luftwaffe did.
They did, but not to the level that your tank commander on the ground could call in an airstrike.
Oh, okay. So, but no, the Russians learned. But you look at the Finnish situation again, where they lost so much, but you kept force. I mean, they'd had 450,000 men. You can't really lose that. And even if they lost 126,000 lost and wounded, if you have enough of them and life is not that important, you can always force your way to win. And it seems that was one of the lessons it almost looks like they took away from Finland, because it wasn't that the Finns were really going to win, they could hold, but they were overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And there was political reasons why Stalin had to end that before the British bombed their petroleum reserves in Pulesti, which Stalin was worried about because it wasn't looking good. Finland has a lot of interesting nuances to it.
It does. So I've been there a couple of times now, and as I'm driving around, it's kind of like, this is not good tank country. It's kind of like, the up order, it says the terrain favors the defender.
Yes.
Yeah, that's Finland.
that's the impression I have. I have invitation that said I'm not coming in the summer. I'm not dealing with the mosquitoes from hell. No, I'm coming in the winter or the autumn or the spring. I'm not coming in mosquito weather.
Like, I was there in May and in August. I don't remember there being much of a mosquito problem.
I mean, this is quite swampy in the summer from what I seem to remember. But I don't know if you can get to that part anymore. I believe most of the Mannerheim lime ended up in Russian territory, didn't it, at the end? But I remember when Ukrainian mosquitoes, forget they're like African mosquitoes. Your arm will swell up, your eyes will turn green and pop out your head.
Sure. You saw in Minnesota we're doing a competition for the new state flag, and one was just like the California Republic flag, except instead of mosquito in Minnesota Republic. Instead of a bear, it was a mosquito.
Mosquito, it is. That state bird should be a damn mosquito.
State bird. Just one more thing for the medics to worry about.
Oh, God,
to attrit your forces.
Mosquitoes is a real thing. Oh God, I was filming a movie 5-6 years ago up in Minnesota, and I had to go to a motorcycle just with my sunglasses and look really cool. I splattered mosquito after mosquito. I was like, this is like, don't do any closer. Look, I've been shot in the face.
So, I mean, if you think about what we do, I mean, we went to Iraq, we went to Afghanistan. We had, was it milfoprimine or something like that? Some tablet that you had to have every damn day to make sure you didn't get malaria.
The malaria thing, yeah. That thing. And the 250,000 shots we got before going anywhere. It's like, you may see different colors after this one. Okay.
The anthrax ones were bad enough as it was.
My lasting memory of a brief was for Africa, where, and if there's anyone who's delicate who's watching this, I'm just go put your coffee on for a minute. We were, of course, you know, when we get in the auditorium, we get to have the medic, the head doctor, the old guy who's been around forever and ever. I'm going to tell you about what you need to worry about here. And when he started talking about that little bacteria thing, if you go in the water that will swim in your penis and anchor itself there. After I regained consciousness, my thought was, okay, don't worry about it. I'm not going to go swimming in Africa. Don't worry about it. It's fine. I'm not even going to fucking shower.
In fairness, I remember getting the STD brief when he showed up for basic in Fort Knox. I said, here are the various STDs you can get around here in Louisville. And it's kind of like, oh, that's putting me off sex for pretty much the next few months. You know, it was kind of like, how can somebody not notice a cauliflower growing between their legs? It's kind of like,
I mean, there's some really weird stuff out there. No. And it's if you think back to World War II or even World War I, where soldiers had to deal with these things without all the modern stuff we have today, with which it's still miserable, but they have nothing. I mean, I guess people were tougher back then. They must have been.
I don't know. I mean, I fully admit I'm a wimp. It's kind of so. Hey, Colonel Warren, do you want to go to Ranger School? I said no.
It seems very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's kind of what I put myself through it. Yeah, no. But you know, before they sent me back in the line, it was kind of like I've spent 10 years in division regimental headquarters. And part of me is going, I want to get back in the line unit. And part of me is going, are you crazy? You're going to be waking up in January in the middle of the piss and rain on, you know, sleeping on the roof of your Humvee. Whereas right now you're working in an air-conditioned tent and you're sitting down, and get a solid night of sleep every night.
But that was fun when you were 25. I think maybe.
Or it didn't hurt as much, at least. I think what happened, my body hit the age of 50 more. You know, okay, it'll be 2 months, but my body hits 50. It's hey, congratulations, you made a half century. Your warranty's expiring, and shit's going to start breaking on you now.
Yeah, I've noticed. I tore my Achilles five months ago, chasing some little criminal down the street, and I've
got arthritis. I was going, what?
Of course,
I have osteoarthritis in the knee. So I go to the medic. Does that mean I can stop running now? You know, put me on the alternate ACFT. I said, well, can he still run? Well, for now. Well, we're going to keep running you until you can't run anymore. So I would rather stop running now than be in sheer pain at the age of 75. But think of all the VA benefits you get out of it. I don't want the benefits. You can keep the damn money. I want my knees.
Here's a wheelchair and your benefits. I mean, look at this one. You only have to run once a year for the PT test. Theoretically.
All right. So I've just been texted by the wife that we're going to the cinema and the show starts in 20 minutes. So I guess you better ask me any last questions really damn quickly.
You know what? What we're probably going to do is at some point in time, we're going to have you and Rex and Drac on. We'll do a foursome and talk about the conclusions, because I'll go toe to toe with the Russians before I go up against your wife. I know how that goes. But what are you saying?
Dogman.
Okay, I mean
the 6-year-old didn't want to see Paddington Bear, and apparently he's got Dogman.
And nobody's going to want to see Cinderella. So
is that even? Oh, right, yeah, the live action. My wife is not too thrilled about that one. I mean, she's a Latina, and is of course our actress who plays Snow White is of a similar persuasion, and my wife's going, "That's not Snow White."
I mean, the Prussian in me will. I'm screaming cultural appropriation here, but having watched the trailer, I'm just saying I'm rooting for the apple.
Oh. All right. Look, I got to head off, but yeah, we're happy to continue on with.
We will
part
we will
two.
do so. We'll talk more about some Russian armor at some point. Maybe they'll let us visit one day.
Well, that's the sad bit about this, is that I don't see myself getting back to Kubik the Tank Museum for 10 years at least. Depending, obviously, unless there's some massive coup d'etat that happens in Russia, and all of a sudden the entire organizational structure changes.
Yeah,
there's so many tanks. I've been there. There's so many lovely tanks that I would love to crawl over or get in, and so on, that I never got a chance to.
Okay,
I'm pleased for the ones that I did. But
do you think that the Russians have the Char C?
I do not.
Oh,
I've seen nothing to indicate that they do.
Heartbreaking.
And why would they anyway?
Well, supposedly they nicked it from Berlin because the Germans nicked it from the French. What's the story?
I haven't seen any evidence that the Char C lasted to 1945.
Yeah,
that wouldn't be surprised if they melted it down. The Americans did the same thing. They melted down a lot of captured stuff.
I know.
Just for the metal.
Hell, they melted down all of the good stuff. That's a different story. And I think I wanted to go to Syria to pick up the last Sturmgeschütz, but I figured this is not the time either.
Safer there than actually. In fairness, I'm not going to keep track what's going on there, but politically, at least, the Russians' tank museum, I don't think it's going to happen. Oh, well.
If I hear differently, I'll let you know. No.
I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.